military terms, the year of 1969 opened for Biafra as bleakly as had 1968. Aba had fallen, Owerri was gone, attacks were being mounted on Umuahia. Before the end of the year, Umuahia would go, but Owerri would be recaptured. It was a year mainly of stalemate, with only small territorial gains by the Nigerian army compared with the previous year. Yet it was a year dominated by three themes, none of them military. It opened with a question being asked in Lagos, London, just about every other capital and in every newspaper office. How much longer can these Biafrans go on? How much more can they take of suffering and deprivation? How many more attacks can they hold off? How much more stubbornness and courage can they draw upon? The answer to all these was at the time, January 1969, unknown. It was to turn out to be for another full year. But how? They had already taken more beatings than any African expert could recall in the history of the continent. The answer to the how lay partly in their leader and partly in the relationship he had with his own people. It was because people to or from shady international financiers. Even one financier would have been a help. This mutual feeling between Emeka and his people not only survived another misery-filled year of resistance, it has survived the 12 years of Emeka's exile. It was and is, in fact, the only secret weapon he ever had. But it is a strong one and unique in Africa. The second theme of 1969 was the growing amount of publicity Biafra received, something that had started in 1968 and continued increasingly. Emeka had decided early on that what had happened to his people stemmed from a policy conceived in closed rooms. He determined that the antidote was to open the doors and windows to let the world see what was really going on. That meant publicity, and though personally rather reserved, he approached the creation of a huge publicity campaign with his usual skill. Before Biafra was crushed, that global publicity campaign had driven Lagos and London to frenzies of rage, frustration, and bewilderment. He succeeded in a manner beyond anyone's expectations. With no communications apart from a single faltering telex link to Sao Tome and Lisbon, he ran rings around Antonio Naharo with his telephone, telex, radio, television, and daily airline links to Europe and America. Even in exile, he had been approached by other African heads of state seeking to know his secret formula. A great joke to him, because in fact there was no formula. It is true that during the war he engaged the services of a public relations agency in Europe and spent money that might otherwise have been used to buy arms. but he estimated that the publicity was in itself a weapon and overwhelmingly a means of securing relief aid for his children. His enemies pointed to the agency and screamed, "That's how he's doing it." But it wasn't at all. The agency was creative only in as much as it put out official bulletins for Biafra and arranged the visits of pressmen with speed and efficiency. For the rest, the agency was distributive. He needed a European contact point because he had no communications. The real publicity campaign was born inside his own head. After listening to advice, he came to 3 decisions. 1. Publicity does not come from simply issuing a stream of propaganda bulletins. Those are for internal consumption. 2. Publicity depends on the world press, newspapers, magazines, radio, and television, and these are served by their own reporters and correspondents. 3. Then give these ladies and gentlemen what they want. What do they want? Answers to see for themselves. So if they want to see it, let them see it. It was a policy that left his civil servants horrified. In Lagos, the press was regarded as thoroughly untrustworthy and to be kept from wandering about as much as possible. They ought to accept the information ministry's handouts as the gospel truth and ask no further. Emeka did the opposite. Apart from the secret military and economic installations, he let them wander where they wished, talking to other experts, priests, relief workers, the 6 mercenaries who departed at the end of 1968, and even his few detainees. He received foreign correspondence endlessly, not just in stiff and formal press conferences, but privately over a can of beer. He let them go to the front and risk getting their heads shot off if they wanted to. He let them walk through the feeding centers and refugee camps, taking their pictures and recording their images. He also managed to receive an endless stream of non-journalistic visitors, MPs, jurists, academics, churchmen, senators, and special emissaries from a dozen countries, allowing them also to see whatever they wished. Occasionally, this led to a hostile report or magazine article, but the overwhelming majority were helpful and quantities were enormous. And that was a so-called magic formula. In a continent where most regimes seek to control the foreign press and only arouse the correspondents' hostility, Emeka gave them his trust, and by and large, they gave him theirs. All this publicity inevitably highlighted the third theme of 1969, the continuing crisis of the starving and dying children as the food blockade policy tightened its grip. As the nightmare of this sea of gaunt infantile faces, a memory that still haunts Emeka today, grew darker and bleaker, he asked the Consultative Assembly and the Consultative Committee of Chiefs and Elders several times if they should not surrender. The answer was consistently, fight on. The food relief program grew and grew, despite all the obstacles. Then in the middle of 1969, a fresh consignment of MiG fighters arrived on the Nigerian side, flown now not by Egyptians like the MiG-15s, but by East Germans. Interestingly, their first target was not a Biafran frontline position, a main bridge, a trunk road, or even Emeka's State House itself. It was the food relief air bridge set up by the Red Cross, Caritas, and Joint Church Aid. On 2nd June, Captain Poley of Australia was landing at Uli Airstrip for the Joint Church Aid with a cargo of milk powder when his cargo plane was riddled from end to end by 2 MiG-17s, flying fast and in close formation in total darkness. On 5th June, the American Captain Brown, flying out of Fernando Po with another cargo of milk for the Red Cross, was intercepted and shot down in flames by another MiG-17. His DC-6 plane was covered all over with large red crosses and white circles. He and his crew died in the marshes around Opobo. It became even harder not to wonder why, if Gowon was not using the hunger of the children as a weapon, it was the Red Cross planes that were designated targets number 1 for his modern MiGs. The misery of the children and the aged continued until the end of the war, despite the efforts of hundreds of relief workers and millions of donors of money across the world. And for the world, it is the face of a hungry child that remains the abiding image. The end finally came in December 1969/January 1970. Both sides knew the British military had indicated that the following spring, if the war was not over, it would have to reconsider its policies. In June 1970, Harold Wilson wanted to go to the British people in a general election. Through the autumn of 1969, massive quantities of new arms poured into Gowon's hands, and in December, the last final assault began. By Christmas, it had made no penetrations anywhere, and a lull developed as both sides rested, panting and tired for the new year. On January 9th, there was an emergency Biafran cabinet meeting at Owerri, now recaptured by the Biafrans. It was agreed that Emeka should fly to Abidjan to see the Ivorian president, and through him possibly even the French president, to seek one last time their intervention towards a negotiated end to the fighting and the suffering. It was his first journey out of Biafra since mid-1968 and was to be his last. Whatever the chances of a negotiated peace might have been, events overtook him. The Ivorian president was not in Abidjan, he was away. Back in Biafra, troops along the southern front outside Aba, hearing their leader had traveled, lost heart and drifted away into the bush. 24 hours after that, on 12 January, the acting head of state, Major General Philip Effiong, yielding to mounting pressure, not from the people but from the officer corps, sued for peace.
To formally give up secession and report for reappointment and redeployment. Philip Effiong.
Hello, Your Excellency. Glad to see you again.
My pleasure.
How are you?
Very well indeed.
Glad to see you again. Thank you.
Patrick Amadi.
How are you?
Excellency.
Glad to see you again.
Thank you very much.
Glad to see you again.
It's an
Welcome
experience.
back. Honestly. Glad to see you again.
And I would like, therefore, to take this opportunity to say that I, Major General Philip Effiong, officer administering the government of the Republic of Biafra, now wish to make the following declaration. That we affirm we are loyal Nigerian citizens and accept the authority of the Federal Military Government of Nigeria. That we accept the existing administrative and political structure of the Federation of Nigeria. That any future constitutional arrangement will be worked out by representatives of the people of Nigeria. That the Republic of Biafra hereby ceases to exist.
Emeka learned the news in Abidjan. For him, the long struggle was over. The even longer exile had just begun.